there, quilty friends, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and today we are adding the binding to our mini quilt. If you are doing the 12-day mini quilt or the 24-day mini quilt, this video is the same for both. Also, if you're using the 2.5 edition fabric or if you are using your own fabric, this video is the same for both. I'll be going through all of those different scenarios. So you ready? Let's get this quilt bound. Now the first step in binding our quilt is to cut our binding to size. I'm going to go ahead and cut the AGF 2.5 edition, and I only need 2 strips of this. So it came with 4, so there would be enough for if you're doing the 12-day or the 24-day, and that way if you started with the 12-day and then you switched to the 24-day, you would already have enough binding fabric, because honestly the cost of 2 strips of fabric wasn't worth turning it into sets of 2 strips and 4 strips. And if you're just doing the 12-day, you'll have 2 extra strips that you can use for whatever else you want, any other projects. They actually make really cute scrunchies, so you can use it to make scrunchies, to bind other quilts, for binding bags. There's lots of things that you can use this binding fabric for. So you'll have a little bit extra if you're just doing the 12-day quilt, and if you're doing the 24-day quilt, then you'll want to use all 4, but you still will have a little bit extra as well. If you're not using this fabric and you are using your own fabric, then you need to cut strips. Now the AGF 2.5 edition is 2.5 inches, so that's 2.5 inches wide. If you like 2.5 inch wide binding, then you can cut your strips 2.5 inches. If you like 2-inch binding, then you can cut your strips 2 inches. If you like 2.25 inch binding, you can cut your strips 2.25 inches. If you don't know, then pick one and see how you like it. Generally speaking, we start out with 2.5 inch, and then you can start playing with other sizes if you feel like the 2.5 inch is too wide for you. But if you don't know, 2.5 inch is a good starting point. So you'll just use your rotary cutter and ruler and cut 2 2.5 inch strips if you're doing the 12-day Advent, or 4 2.5 inch strips if you're doing the 24-day version of the Advent. So I'm cutting with the 2.5 edition. I am not using a rotary cutter and ruler to cut it because I want to cut it as accurately as possible, and I don't need to get out a rotary cutter and ruler because the dotted line tells me exactly where to cut, because they already have this pre-printed for me as binding fabric. So I'm just going to cut my strips, and then we'll be right back to sew them together. So we've cut our binding strips, and there's 2 ways that you can choose to sew these together. The first is generally preferable, which is where they line up, because once we put this binding fabric on, then we'll want our little green holly and our cards to be on the same side. But if you want to have more variety of designs in your binding strip, you can actually sew them together intentionally the other way, so that way you get all the designs in your binding if that's what you want. I'm going to go with kind of like the generally accepted way, which is having the binding the same, and we're going to align these up square to one another, and we're going to stitch diagonally. Now sometimes people stitch this wrong and it gets super frustrating, so here's my tip for how to stitch diagonally. Generally when people stitch diagonally the wrong way, they stitch this way, because it feels like sewing it in half, because you've got 1 small strip and 1 big strip, and then 1 small strip and 1 big strip. But you'll end up with having sewn your big strip to a small piece. What you want to do is you actually want to sew them this way. So you're sewing to bisect your good pieces that you're keeping and the pieces you're cutting off. So you want to have the pieces you're cutting off on one side and the pieces you're keeping on the other side. And if you remember that, you will always have your line stitched the right direction. So we are stitching the side we keep, the side we cut. Now you can draw a diagonal line on here if you like, if that's your preference, or you can eyeball it. I already have my fabric marking pen out here, and I have a ruler. So while I generally just eyeball it, I have the tools right here to do things the right way. So we'll go ahead and do them the right way. And then if you want to pin that to hold it in place, you can also pin that to hold it in place if you like. Now we're just going to take it over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew right on that line. If you use diagonal seam tape, you could also use diagonal seam tape instead of drawing a line. That's also an option. So we're just going to go ahead and stitch this. And now we're going to cut off the part that we don't need. You can always open it up to double check. Did I do this right? Yes, I did. So we're going to just trim and then cut to, I eyeball a little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch because I'd rather have a little more than a little less. But you can use a ruler and rotary cutter if you want to have that be exactly a 1/4 inch. And now we need to press this. So it doesn't matter if you are a side presser or an open presser. When it comes to bindings, you want to press open. And that's because side pressers say, okay, I pressed the side so there's not a hole in my fabric. Well, when you fold this in half, there won't be any holes. And we want to press it open because pressing it open spreads the bulk across. And by spreading the bulk across, then we don't have problems with a lump in our binding. So we want to press it open. Don't worry about holes in your quilt. That's not a thing. Once you've pressed your seam, we're going to press the whole thing in half to create our binding strip. And there are tools that can help you with this if you like. I generally just grab my iron, fold it in half, and press. Now we're going to look at adding it onto our quilt. With this 2.5 edition, we have some options. So you can see it has different designs. And whatever design you have facing the quilt is the design that's going to show up. So if I do it this way, the cars are going to show up on the front and the peppermints are going to show up on the back. If I do it the other way, this holly leaf is going to show up on the front and these candies on the back. And if I like one of those designs, but I want it the other way around, then you actually just sew it the other way where you sew it to the back. So if I sewed it to the back, the holly leaves would be on the back and the candy would be on the front. I really want these cars on the front. I think that's going to look really fun driving around the quilt top. So I'm going to have the cars facing the quilt. And I'm going to give myself a good like 10 inches or so, start somewhere kind of middle-ish on one side and sew all the way around. Now, when I use 2.5 inch wide binding, because I have such a thin batting, instead of doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I do about a 1/16 of an inch more than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I find that that fits better on the quilt as it wraps around the quilt. This is one of those things that you'll learn as you put on bindings and play with it and say, ooh, I need a little more, I need a little less. You can always start with a 1/4 inch, and if you have a little extra fabric on the back of your binding, it's not a big deal. It's always better to have a little extra binding on the back of your fabric or on the back of your quilt than not have enough binding to make it all the way around the back of your quilt and then you have to re-sew the whole thing on again. So I'll be doing just a little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch just because that's my experience and I know that that's what works. Generally it's the very edge of my J-foot on my baby lock machine, and that's what works for me based on the thickness of my batting. But for you, depending on how thick your batting is, some people like to do double batting. That's going to change exactly the seam allowance that you need on your binding for it to wrap all the way around. So the width of your binding plus the thickness of your quilt plus how much you want it to wrap over to the back are all things to consider when you figure out what your true seam allowance is when adding on your binding. All right, so we're going to take this over to the sewing machine. And another thing that you can do when putting bindings on, if you know that you need a little more wiggle room one way or the other, but you don't want to have to eyeball it being up against the edge of your presser foot, is you can actually move your needle position. So it might be edge of my presser foot, but my needle position goes 1 or 2 dots to the right or to the left in order to keep everything on the straight and narrow and lined up when I'm all done. So people who find bindings tricky tend to find it tricky at the corners, but the corners are really simple because you're going to sew up to this corner, but you need it to go around this way, and right now it's facing towards you. So the easiest way to get it to face the other way is actually to start by flipping it into a mitered corner, just like this, and then flipping that mitered corner back onto itself to go the right direction. Now once you've done that, what happens is you have your little shark fin of a mitered corner sitting right here, and it's facing towards the machine, and you'll end up sewing that down, which you don't want. So you'll need to flip that shark fin towards yourself, and that way it'll be out of the way. Now there's different techniques for like sewing it like off the end of the quilt, or I actually like to sew right up to that mitered corner, stitch back and stitch forth, and then flip around. I usually don't break my thread. I usually cut that when I'm flipping over the binding, but that's up to you. There is definitely more than one way to bind a quilt. I don't know about ways to skin cats because I've never done that before, but I've bound lots and lots of quilts, and I've tried lots of different ways, and this just is my favorite.